The Texas sun didn't forgive anyone. It burned down on the flat plains, turning the air into a silver haze. A military truck rattled down a dirt road, its canvas flapping in the wind. When it stopped, a dozen German prisoners stepped out, blinking into the light. Their boots crunched on gravel. Their uniforms were faded from months of war and dust. These men had fought in Africa and Italy. They expected barbed wire, barking guards, and punishment. Instead, what they saw were cattle. A ranch stretched out before them, miles of dry grass, fences, and the low, steady sound of mooing in the heat. A man in a wide-brimmed hat walked toward them. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. A lasso hung over one shoulder. Through a translator, he spoke calmly. "You boys will be helping us on the ranch. Fences, cattle drives, whatever needs doing." The Germans stared, unsure if they had understood correctly. Was this a joke? These were men trained to fight under the swastika. Now, instead of rifles, they were being handed work gloves. The foreman nodded once, tipped his hat, and walked away. No shouting, no threats, just work waiting to be done. At first, the silence felt strange. No explosions, no officers yelling orders, only the wind and the sound of cattle shifting in the heat. One young prisoner, barely 20, looked around at the endless horizon. The land seemed bigger than anything he had ever seen. He whispered to the man beside him, "This isn't a prison. This is another planet." Within days, the prisoners were riding in the backs of pickup trucks, bumping across dry pastures, following cowboys on horseback. The work was hard, and the sun was merciless. But the food, thick beef stew, bread, and coffee, was more than any of them had eaten for months. For the Texans, the scene was just as strange. They had expected dangerous Nazis, angry, brainwashed men. What they saw instead were skinny kids who worked carefully and said, "Yes, sir." At first, both sides kept their distance. The cowboys didn't trust the Germans, and the Germans didn't know what the cowboys might do. But the land didn't wait for anyone. Fences had to be mended, cattle needed herding, and chores filled every daylight hour. By the second week, something started to change. The Germans began copying the cowboys' movements, the way they tied wire, lifted feed sacks, or whistled to get a steer moving. The cowboys, amused, started teaching them a few English words. Post, saddle, coffee. Nobody called it friendship. It was just work. But it was work that slowly broke down the walls between them. For the German prisoners, the shock wasn't only in what they were asked to do. It was in how they were treated. They weren't shouted at. They weren't beaten. They were judged by how well they worked, not by what flag they had fought under. That realization planted a quiet question in their minds, one no propaganda could erase. If this was America, the enemy they had been taught to hate, what else had been a lie? And as the sun dropped behind the flat horizon, the prisoners watched the cowboys ride off into the red dust. Somewhere deep inside, many began to feel something unexpected: curiosity. They thought their war was over. In truth, another kind of battle was just beginning. A battle between everything they'd been told and what they were starting to see with their own eyes. By the summer of 1943, Texas was full of strangers. They didn't come by choice. They came as prisoners. Thousands of German soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy were shipped across the Atlantic to the quiet heart of America. To them, Texas sounded like the end of the world. Hot, empty, and wild. When the trains arrived, the men pressed their faces to the barred windows. They saw miles of open land, green fields, Small towns with white church steeples and kids riding bikes down dust roads. No ruins, no bomb craters, no air raid sirens. Just peace. For men who had left cities like Hamburg or Cologne in flames, it felt unreal. One whispered, "There's no war here." The camps they entered were nothing like the nightmares Nazi propaganda had promised. Yes, there were fences and watchtowers, but inside, clean barracks, a kitchen, even a library. Red Cross trucks came regularly. Every man got medical checkups, clothes, and meals that would make a German civilian cry. Steak, potatoes, bread with butter, coffee, real coffee. Each prisoner received over 3,000 calories a day, the same as American soldiers. Back home, their families were surviving on black bread and turnip soup. The shock wasn't just physical, it was moral. In Germany, they had been told America was falling apart, violent, hungry, and ruled by chaos. Yet here they were, prisoners of war, eating better than civilians in the Reich. Soon, they learned how it worked. The United States had a labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas fighting. Farms and ranches were desperate for workers. So under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer to work in exchange for small payments called canteen credits that could be used to buy cigarettes, candy, or postcards. For the ranchers, it was simple. They needed hands. For the prisoners, it was a chance to get out of the fence, see the sky, and earn something that felt like normal life. What amazed the Germans most wasn't the work, though. It was how organized everything was. Trucks arrived on time. Tools were shared and returned. Food never ran out. Nobody stole. Nobody hoarded. It was a quiet, invisible system that just worked. One former prisoner later wrote, "We expected to see America's weakness. Instead, we saw its strength in every meal, every mile of road, every rule that made sense." Every day behind that barbed wire chipped away at old beliefs. The war had taught them to see the enemy as monsters. But in Texas, their guards were mostly young farm boys, polite, curious, and sometimes just as nervous as the prisoners. They followed rules but didn't humiliate. When the workday ended, some even shared cigarettes through the fence. It was impossible to square that kindness with the propaganda they'd been fed for years. The Germans began writing home, carefully, since all letters were censored, describing what they saw. "The Americans feed us well," one wrote. "There is order here, discipline without cruelty." For their families back in bombed-out cities, it sounded like fantasy. But for the men in Texas, it was a new kind of truth, one learned not from speeches or slogans, but from the taste of good food and the fairness of their captors. By the end of that first summer, the word enemy had started to lose its meaning. These men had expected punishment. What they found instead was proof that freedom could feed people better than fear ever could. And that realization would change everything that came next. The first day on the ranch was chaos. The German prisoners lined up like soldiers, stiff and nervous, waiting for orders that never came. The cowboys, used to loose schedules and wide skies, didn't bark commands. They just pointed and said, "Fix that fence," or "Move those cattle." It was a language of gestures, dust, and sweat. At first, the Germans struggled. The Texas heat hit them like a wall. Their boots sank into the dry earth. Their hands blistered from wire and tools. Some muttered that this work was beneath them. They were trained for tanks and rifles, not cows and shovels. But the land didn't care who you were. A fence was broken, a herd needed moving. and the only way to survive the day was to work. By the second week, the rhythm started to settle in. The men rose before sunrise, ate quickly, and rode in the backs of pickup trucks to the fields. The cowboys showed them how to stretch wire, mend posts, and load feed. Most of it was learned by watching, not talking. The Germans copied every move, and something strange happened. They got better at it. One prisoner later said, "I had fought in Africa and Sicily. I thought I knew hardship. Then I met a Texas summer. The work was punishing but honest. The air smelled of dust and sweat and cattle. At noon, the cowboys shared cold water and sandwiches. Nobody talked much. The sound of chewing and wind was enough. For many prisoners, it was the first time since the war began that they felt human again. No shouting, no propaganda, just work that made sense. The cowboys, for their part, were surprised too. They'd expected stubborn, arrogant soldiers. What they saw were tired young men trying to prove themselves. Some cowboys started calling them the boys instead of the Krauts. One cowboy joked, "They can't rope worth a damn, but they fix a fence straight as a ruler." That kind of humor broke the ice faster than orders ever could. By midsummer, the prisoners were part of the daily ranch rhythm. They learned to read the sky for storms, to guide cattle across dry creek beds, to stay quiet when a steer turned wild. They learned that every man, cowboy or captive, was judged by his effort, not his past. Then came the cattle drive. Hundreds of animals had to be moved to a new pasture. The Germans were nervous. The noise, the dust, the shouting in English. When the herd started to bolt, everything turned to chaos. Men ran, horses whirled, dust filled the air. But instinct kicked in. The prisoners grabbed fence rails, waved arms, shouted to each other in German. They helped push the herd back into line. When it was over, everyone was covered in dirt and sweat, cowboys and prisoners alike. No one spoke for a moment. Then a cowboy grinned and said, "Not bad, boys." It wasn't praise from an officer. It was respect from a man who worked hard himself. That night, the prisoners sat around the campfire, sore and exhausted, watching sparks drift into the dark. For the first time, they laughed. They had come to Texas as defeated soldiers. But under that endless sky, swinging hammers and driving cattle, they were becoming something new. Not prisoners, not enemies, just workers on the same land. By fall, the fences were holding, the herds were fat, and the lines between prisoners and ranch hands had started to blur. The Germans had picked up English words: wire, haystack, coffee. Cowboys learned a few German ones too, mostly curse words and jokes. What had begun as work became a kind of daily routine that felt normal. Every morning, the same scene played out. Dust rising, trucks rumbling, cowboys yelling over the wind. The Germans worked hard, sometimes harder than the locals. The cowboys respected that. Around here, effort meant more than rank or background. Lunch breaks were the equalizer. Everyone sat in the shade, passing around tin cups of coffee thick enough to chew. Cowboys would tell stories about storms, horses, or their brothers fighting overseas. The Germans listened quietly, not sure what to say. Then one day, one of them offered a story back about growing up on a small farm near Munich. The laughter that followed wasn't forced. It was real. Food became its own kind of diplomacy. Stew, biscuits, chili, and pies the size of wagon wheels. The prisoners couldn't believe the portions. In Germany, meat was a memory. Here, it was daily life. The cowboys didn't flaunt it. They just shared it. To them, feeding someone was a matter of respect. At night, guards sometimes turned a blind eye when prisoners played harmonica or sang old songs by the fire. A cowboy might join in with a country tune. Nobody cared about the words. It was the rhythm that mattered. The biggest surprise for the prisoners wasn't the food or the freedom. It was the attitude. Cowboys didn't bow to anyone. They took pride in what they did, fixing fences, breaking horses, keeping the ranch running. No medals, no ranks, no speeches, just results. To men raised in a strict military world, that was hard to understand. In Germany, power came from titles and uniforms. In Texas, it came from competence. A cowboy who could ride through a storm, repair a saddle, and calm a spooked steer, that man had authority, even if he never said a word. The Germans began to see something powerful in that freedom. It wasn't the chaos they'd been warned about. It was responsibility, each man standing on his own feet, judged by what he could do. One prisoner later said, "We thought Americans had no discipline, but we saw a different kind of order, an order that came from choice, not fear." Sometimes, when the day's work was done, they'd sit outside the camp fence, talking through it. Cowboys asked about life in Germany, about families, about whether every soldier had believed in Hitler. The prisoners gave careful answers, but more often, they shrugged and said, "We didn't know what to believe." Those quiet talks did more than fill time. They built understanding. Both sides started seeing each other, not as enemies, but as men caught in the same storm. By winter, the line between captor and captive had faded into habit. The Germans worked the land. The cowboys made sure they were treated fair. When it rained, they took shelter together. When a steer got loose, they chased it together. And when coffee boiled black in a tin pot over the fire, they drank it together. The war still raged across the ocean, but here, on these wide Texas plains, something else was happening. Something quieter and maybe stronger. Enemies were learning how to live side by side. When the war finally ended, the Texas camps began to empty. Trains rolled out one after another, carrying German prisoners back toward a home that barely existed anymore. For many, the hardest moment wasn't leaving captivity, it was leaving Texas. They looked out the train windows at the open land that had changed them, the wide sky, the fences they had built, the ranch houses where they'd shared meals with men who had once been their enemies. Some even waved goodbye to cowboys who had come to see them off. Germany was waiting, but it wasn't the Germany they remembered. Cities were rubble. Streets were silent. Families were scattered or gone. For men who had just spent years working under the Texas sun, eating well, and living with a sense of purpose, the shock was overwhelming. One former prisoner wrote, "I came home as a free man, but I had more freedom in Texas." They told their families stories that no one at first believed, about steak dinners, about guards who treated them with respect, about cowboys who had shared jokes and coffee. For people surrounded by hunger and ruins, those stories sounded like fantasy, but they were true. Many of these former prisoners carried more than memories. They brought home lessons. They had seen how Americans worked, how farmers and ranchers valued efficiency, fairness, and hard labor over slogans or politics. They had watched ordinary people solve problems with practicality instead of pride. When West Germany began to rebuild, those lessons took root. Former POWs started farms, opened workshops, became engineers and builders. Some used methods they'd learned in Texas: crop rotation, machine repair, teamwork without hierarchy. They talked about how respect could go both ways, even between former enemies. A few even came back. In the years after the war, letters crossed the Atlantic, from Germany to Texas, from ranchers to the men who had once mended their fences. Some Germans returned to visit. A handful immigrated for good, starting new lives in the same land where they'd once been prisoners. The cowboys hadn't set out to change anyone's mind. They were just doing their jobs, keeping cattle fed, fences fixed, and the ranch alive while the world was at war. But in the process, they'd done something extraordinary. They had quietly dismantled propaganda with simple decency. The Germans had been told that America was corrupt, weak, divided. Instead, they saw a place that ran on fairness, humor, and endless energy. A country that could feed its enemies and still win the war. That was America's hidden weapon. Not just its factories or armies, but its attitude. The belief that work has dignity, that freedom demands responsibility, and that respect doesn't have to stop at a barbed wire fence. When those men looked back years later, they didn't talk much about battles. They talked about the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of boots on dry earth, and the people who showed them that strength doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from character. The Germans had arrived as prisoners. They left as witnesses to America's greatest victory, the victory of its way of life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy true stories that reveal the human side of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. There are more untold chapters waiting to be discovered right here on our channel.